Good afternoon, everybody. I'm back with the anchor point. My name is Nqaba Mabece on the backdrop of what has been an especially heavy 2 weeks for the National Prosecuting Authority, not least because the head of IDAC, Miss Andrea Johnson, had last week and this week one of the heaviest weeks she surely would have had in her profession. It really does start in her evidence that she started giving last week that ended a couple of days ago before Justice Madlanga, and it is that I really want to take you through today. Let's talk about the National Prosecuting Authority. This is an authority that is 28 years old this year. It was started by Mr. Nqaba, who was the inaugural National Director of Public Prosecutions, and he didn't have too great a team to start it off with. In fact, I had an interview a couple of weeks back with Mr. Nqaba. It was Mr. Nqaba, Ms. Hermione Cronje, and Mr. Nqaba. They are the founding officials, if you will, of the National Prosecuting Authority. Of course, a lot has since changed in the intervening 28-year period, and there are many officers within that of the National Director of Public Prosecutions or the National Prosecuting Authority. One very important office was disbanded some 15 or so years back. We're talking about the DSO, the Directorate of Special Operations. All I'm trying to get at here is this is an institution that has been at the front and center of the South African criminal justice system. And for the best part of its 28 years, it has been in troubled waters. I don't propose to go through the history of the institution. Suffice to say, what we saw last week was probably as good a picture as one might have hoped to get, which would be a mirror image of the institution and the culture that has largely come to characterize it against the senior officials who, over the years, have struggled to start, remain in office, and complete their terms in a manner in which speaks to the credible running of an institution and a proper reflection of a culture that indeed does aspire to rid our society of the rogue elements within it. Unfortunately, in this instance, I'm making references to the former head of IDAC, investigating Directorate against corruption, Miss Andrea Johnson, who started her testimony before Justice Madlanga at the inquiry as the head of IDAC. And by the time she completed her testimony, she had resigned with immediate effect, a resignation that was similarly immediately accepted by the president, and she left office, or rather she left the witness stand as a former head of IDAC and an unemployed person. Most troubling was what she had to ultimately concede. We do know that before ad hoc committee in Parliament, we know there she made a lot of false claims, which were not challenged, unfortunately, but that came to light before Justice Madlanga and co-commissioners Sandile Khumalo and Sisi Baloyi, who had all the time in the world and the skill with which to precisely disentangle the mess that she had found herself in, the myriad of lies. Over the course of time, she became embroiled in, frankly speaking. So let's talk about the mandate of IDAC. It comes on the backdrop of the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture and the recommendations piecemeal that were coming through. It became pretty clear that an investigating directorate was necessary. This is 2019. President Ramaphosa establishes this office not long after confirming to the nation who the NPA head was, Ms. Shamila Batohi, somebody who came with a lot of promise, and I wouldn't imagine that promise carried through for all of her tenure to the time that she would vacate office earlier this year into retirement. The IDAC is established in 2019. The founding leader of IDAC is Ms. Hermione Cronje, and she lasts a mere 2 years after that, citing reasons of her departure being that there was just no institutional support. She found herself exposed. She was struggling to attract the talent, and there didn't seem to be the kind of commitment within the National Prosecuting Authority that was consistent with what the Investigating Directorate was established for. In other words, she did not enjoy support from the leadership, and you can fill in the blanks as to who the leadership was, either within the institution or outside the institution. But she felt, in her words, it was only a matter of time before a snare would have been put in front of her for her to essentially walk into and then create room for her to be arrested on what is clearly a culture that was willing to go to the extent of fabricating information and charges to get rid of people who were in the way of what the broader agenda or the agenda of the hidden hand was. So this is happening 2019 into 2021, 2022 for Hermione Cronje. I just mix up the times when she vacated office. Because of this challenge, Parliament responds, the National Prosecuting Amendment Act, and that act establishes IDAC as we now know it, and the inaugural head of IDAC, as it grew from ID to IDAC, is Miss Andrea Johnson, the witness over the last couple of days, this week and the week past. She has a very impressive record. She is a career prosecutor. She has the qualifications to match. I mean, I'm looking at her CV right now, and it is quite impressive. I mean, anybody who has this sort of profile would be impressive. She has a B. Juris degree from Durban Westville. She has an LLB degree from Durban Westville. She has a diploma in criminal justice and forensic auditing from the University of Johannesburg, together with many short courses, including corruption and the new act. I would imagine the new act is probably PRECA in that instance. Money laundering and counterterrorism. These are short courses for which she trained. Operations management program, so that's the administration component of it. Investigative support systems and techniques, all very useful as a former National Director of Public Prosecutions, as well as the head of IDAC, as well as multiple project management courses that she attended. This is somebody who is not short of understanding the terrain in which her skills would be deployed. At the time of her departure, she was the head of IDAC. Before then, she had held multiple positions, including being a prosecutor in the Magistrates Court, being a junior state advocate. She would one time become a senior state advocate, and she was the Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions, focusing specifically or located within the DSO, the Scorpions as it was then known, until their disbanding, until she became who she was. So this profile is important to paint the background of who it is and the level at which she pitches from a law enforcement perspective for her to have gone and become as rogue as she would, at least on the evidence of her testimony. Was she a credible witness? Emphatically, no. I've made references to how she was at the ad hoc. She courted praise, including being told she was a Winnie Mandela who has multiplied. She was told that the position that she holds is one that doesn't always court praise, which is very true. And effectively, she came out with her reputation intact at the ad hoc, a far cry to how things would end up before Justice Madlanga, which should already tell you how the two platforms have approached the inquiry into the policing challenges. At some point, the evidence leader, Advocate Sello, confirmed that she was throwing investigators under the bus because she simply wouldn't commit herself to some of the things that had taken place under her watch in her tenure. Of course, she would deny that. Towards the end of her testimony, though, she wound up not answering to questions, citing that she would prefer not to incriminate herself, an indulgence that was given by the evidence leader as well as Justice Madlanga and the co-commissioners in that matter. Worryingly, either during the course of her testimony or immediately after, so it would have been last week or this week, it is clear from what we heard yesterday from Ms. Ramsamy that Ms. Johnson was still engaging junior members of staff of IDAC. This is either her still as the IDAC leader or subsequent to that, because she resigned midway through her testimony, which resignation was immediately accepted. So this is either the head of IDAC or a former head of IDAC engaging junior members of staff, to her at least, in IDAC in terms of what to do and what not to do if they should get the call to come and give testimony. And Ms. Ramsamy played that video recording. This is troubling because it engages questions about her judgment. It engages questions about her character. And at this point, I should pause to say we are talking about Andrea Johnson. I do not and am not addressing the question of the Indian narrative that has unfortunately become somewhat of a strong narrative that has since developed to the point that the Minister of Justice had to engage the demographic composition of the members of IDAC and the NPA more broadly speaking. You see, the challenge with race classifications is exactly why we are the nation and society that we are, that has, in real terms, the Constitution opening with these words through its preamble. We, the people of South Africa, recognize our injustices of the past. Those are the challenges we got as a society because of apartheid before and colonialism before. Because of how people, when racially classified and no more, these are the challenges society get. I should say, I expect people to disagree with me on this one, and they would be more than entitled to do so because their experiences would inform the opinions they go on to venture. But I thought it was incredibly important for the Minister of Justice to dispel the notion that this is a conversation about Indian people. It was merely a conversation about Andrea Johnson and everybody else who has subsequently been suspended or dismissed. The incidental to that, as far as I can take it, is that they are Indian. They were not doing this thing because they were Indian, and that distinction for me is clear. We are a rainbow nation and we need to accommodate our diversity because it is one of the strengths we as a society should enjoy. With regard to her appreciation of the law, she found herself wanting on a couple of occasions, and I say couple really as a euphemism. She was found wanting on a few occasions the difference between a subjective test, what happens in the mind of the person who is under the inquiry or against whom the inquiry is made, subjective test, or objective test. Would a reasonable person come to the same conclusion? She was at pains, seemingly in the early part of her evidence, to make a clear distinction between what subjective test was and objective test was. The charges that, specifically those that were preferred against General Masemola, I think, towards the end of her testimony, is something that the commissioners took her through for her to try and help them understand exactly how they were crafted and whether or not they had an appreciation of the law. This in relation to the ID's mandate in terms of Section 7 of the National Prosecuting Authority Act, and some of the charges that ostensibly were drafted against the NPA Act, where it was clear the charges and the reading of the Act, the two are not tenable. I make an example further of how the PFMA itself, Section 38, was used to draft charges against General Masemola when it is clear that the interpretation of the the interpretation of the Public Finance Management Act, PFMA, Section 38 thereof, is not tenable against the basis on the charges that were preferred against him in terms of the National Prosecuting Authority Act. It goes on, this conversation about her poor understanding of the law or rogueness within the law, or using the law to engage her rogue behavior as it would turn out. At least there are strong suggestions that she was rogue. Sections 155, 156, and 157 of the Criminal Procedure Act, the fact that General Masemola is lumped together with the Ketmatlalas of the world in supposedly the criminal conduct, suggesting that they were acting in concert, when it is clear that the conduct of Ketmatlala and the conduct of General Masemola, the two do not find common charges. There's no common purpose there. There is no accessory to the fact. There is nothing that makes them accessories to whatever the charges that were preferred against Masemola are. And how even she went about joining him to the charges. That's where Justice Madlanga and subsequent to that, Advocate Baloyi simply came to the conclusion that this was only done for one purpose and one purpose alone. That was to embarrass the commissioner. It was to achieve him appearing in court by any means necessary. This is true too for Lieutenant General Khumalo, who we had been told before by Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi as well, it was a winch hunt against him. This is now PKTT stuff. Talking about PKTT, this is the value of that Section 27, Section 28 affidavit and the summons. Remember, at the time when the Section 27 summons was signed, and I'm going to talk about the value of signature very shortly, which will become my last point, The PKTT was not under investigation, but the summons confirmed that they were. This after the disbanding of the PKTT, which happened in December 2024, but this summons is signed in April 2025. Annexure B thereof, Part 6, reflects the PKTT. It should not have been there. It was there. Advocate Johnson was taken through in her evidence that she doesn't sign things. She acquaints herself and satisfies herself that what she is signing is something that which, as a counting officer, she can own and can speak to. She confirmed yes. And then she was asked, then why did you sign this knowing what you knew about PKTT and the fact that it had been in the news for the best part of that year following its disbanding by Police Minister Senzo Mchunu? I cannot take it further than that, Chairperson. I relied on briefing from my investigators. I was not aware. Again, I talked about her credibility. These are all the things that ate into her credibility. More, it spoke to the fact that they were ultra vires operating outside their power, outside the mandate of IDAC by engaging themselves in, on the strength of that affidavit, what was clearly an operational issue, human resources issues at PKTT that could never and should never have triggered the mandate of the NPA, at least not of the ID, I beg your pardon, at least not in terms of the National Prosecuting Authority Act, in terms of Section 7, which is where their mandate is located. And I should sign off by talking about the value of the signature. You know, the value of a signature is established in our law as the cavia subscriptor. Let the signer beware. The best way to understand this is this. Do not sign what you do not know, and what you do not know, you do not sign. When you reduce your signature to a document, you must be prepared to be bound by what is in that agreement, because your signature is there. There are notable exceptions: duress, mistake, or being misled. Those are established exceptions. But generally, if you cannot prove, and the assumption carries that because you signed, you are bound, and if you want to extract yourself from that contract, let me call it that, by virtue of your signature having been reduced, you now need to prove the existence of the mitigation of, I was under duress, they held a gun to my head, I had no option but to sign it, failing which I would have been killed. Extreme example, but that's essentially how I'm driving the point of the meaning of duress. It was a mistake. It was a lie, misrepresentation. And very recently, which upends somewhat this institution, which has been over 100 years in establishment, when a particular term of this contract is an unusual one. It's not consistent with all terms of contracts of this nature. This is a recent judgment. I don't want to get into it as well. But even that should tell you that when Andrea Johnson reduced her signature to that Section 27 summons, it was clear as at that point, because she did say she reads everything line by line. I was there in person when this conversation and exchange was happening between her and Justice Madlanga. She had satisfied herself that this is what she can speak to. And unfortunately, during the 6 or so days she was on the witness stand, it became pretty clear that, one, there was a hidden hand there. The question is who, and only time will answer that question if we get an answer from it. She was prepared by any means necessary to use the law, using interpretations that are quite inconsistent with the intention of the legislature in terms of the PFMA, in terms of the National Prosecuting Authority Act, in terms of the Criminal Procedure Act, to achieve the mission on behalf of this hidden hand. But most worrying, for one, should be that the office of IDAC has been reduced to that, and IDAC within the National Prosecuting Authority Act. That should be the major concern of South Africans. Of course, they should be concerned that somebody who would have gone through the system to become the head of IDAC herself became what she became by virtue of what we saw. But the greater loss here is the fact that the public's trust in the criminal justice system has suffered a heavy blow. And unfortunately, as it is, it takes forever to build but the deconstruction project can happen in a matter of seconds. In this case, it was 6 days. That's all we needed to learn about who Miss Andrea Johnson was. Now, they've given her a nickname in the office. Apparently, the nickname is, what is it again? Flip-flopper, something like that. She says this and she does that. Flip-flopper knee-jerk. Yes, flip-flopper knee-jerk. That's what Ms. Ramsamy anyway says was the nickname of Miss Johnson in the office. Let that sink in, that your team of investigators would reflect on its leadership in that way. Quite exactly what the recommendations from Justice Madlanga are going to be in the end, only time again will tell. South Africa has suffered and has suffered massively with this. Thankfully, Mr. Mothibi was able to use his executive authority as the National Director of Public Prosecutions to withdraw totally the charges as were preferred against those seven or so members of the PKTT, including Khumalo, including Brigadier Mokwele. But can we just also consider the fact that their careers, for many of those persons, are in tatters? For what? Interference and political gamesmanship within the institution. It's possible that the same fate might follow that of General Masemola if Mr. Mothibi should withdraw the charges that have been preferred against him. And whether or not that happens, the damage to the persons, to their good names, the credibility of the institution, the damage is done. And the question is, when are the ghosts of this haunted house, that is the National Prosecuting Authority, going to vacate? Anchor point with me, Nqaba Mabece. Thank you so much for your time.